The heavy scent of industrial-grade ammonia and the rhythmic swish thud of a mop were the only markers of Elias Thorne's existence. To the high-powered executives at the Sterling Green law firm, Elias wasn't a person. He was a moving piece of the building's architecture, as unremarkable as the drywall or the elevators. He was a tall, quiet black man with silver-threaded hair and hands that looked like topographical maps of a hard-lived life. For 40 years, Elias arrived when the sun dipped below the skyline and left before the first Starbucks cup hit a mahogany desk. He knew the secrets of the powerful, not their scandals, but their debris. He knew who worked late because they were lonely, who was sloppy with their coffee, and who never bothered to look up and say, "Thank you," when he emptied their trash. Society had labeled Elias as low status. In the grand hierarchy of the city, a janitor was at the bottom, a man who had failed to climb the ladder. But status is a lens that often blurs the truth. While the world saw a man with a bucket, Elias was actually an architect of souls. 30 years prior, Elias had encountered 3 sisters, Sarah, Emily, and Lily, huddled in the freezing basement of an apartment complex he cleaned. They were white, orphaned, and terrified of a foster system that promised to separate them. Elias had every reason to walk away. He was a black man in a city where one wrong move could lead to a cell. He was poor. He had no standing. Yet he chose a path of invisible heroism. He didn't just give them a place to stay. He gave them a fortress. He worked 3 jobs, scrubbing floors until his knees burned, just to buy a set of encyclopedias. He lived on bread and water so the girls could have new shoes for school. He stayed in the shadows, intentionally making himself small so they could grow large. He knew that if the world saw a poor black janitor raising 3 white girls, the system would take them. So he became the ultimate ghost, the invisible provider who never asked for a spotlight. The true test of his heroism came when the high-status world tried to crush him. A corrupt partner at the firm, needing a scapegoat for a massive embezzlement scheme, pointed at the man who had the keys to every room but no voice to defend himself, the janitor. The police didn't look for a second suspect. To them, Elias was exactly what his title suggested, someone disposable. But heroism leaves a trail. The nobodies Elias had raised were now the somebodies the world feared. When Sarah, now a top-tier defense attorney, stood in that courtroom, she didn't just defend a client. She revealed a king. The story of Elias Thorne proves that titles are just costumes we wear. A CEO can be a moral bankrupt, and a janitor can be a savior. True heroism isn't found in the applause of a crowd or the weight of a wallet. It's found in the quiet, consistent choice to do what is right when no one is watching. Elias didn't need a cape or a title. He had the calluses on his hands and the lives of 3 women who were his living legacy. In the end, the invisible man was the only one who truly saw what mattered. The courtroom was a theater of cold, calculated power. On one side stood the prosecution, sharp suits, expensive watches, and a smug air of certainty. In the center, slumped in a wooden chair that felt more like a cage, was Elias Thorne. For 40 years, Elias had been a shadow in the hallways of the city's elite, a black man whose existence was defined by the dirt he removed for others. Now, he was being accused of a crime he couldn't even understand, a sacrificial lamb for a wealthy man's greed. The status reversal in Elias's story is not just a plot twist, it is the ultimate moral correction. At the start of the trial, the power dynamic is suffocatingly lopsided. The prosecutor speaks over Elias. The judge looks past him, and the gallery sees only a poor janitor, whose age and race made him an easy target. He was a man with no resources, no voice, and apparently no friends. He was at the absolute mercy of a system that had ignored him his entire life. But then, the atmosphere shifted. It began with the sound of the courtroom doors being pushed open, not with hesitation, but with authority. When the three women entered, the room didn't just go quiet. It reorganized itself. They weren't just witnesses. They were the personification of the very high society power the prosecutor tried to wield. The eldest, Sarah, walked past the bar with the predatory grace of a woman who owned every room she stepped into. She didn't sit in the back. She walked straight to the defense table and placed a hand on Elias's trembling shoulder. The visual of that moment is where the power begins to flip. You have a man the world considers bottom tier being touched with reverence by a woman the world considers top tier. As the trial progressed, the status reversal reached its peak. The prosecutor, who had spent the morning sneering at Elias's lack of education, suddenly found himself being dismantled by Sarah's legal brilliance. Every piece of ironclad evidence he had was revealed to be a house of cards. Then came the expert testimony. Emily, the surgeon, presented forensic evidence with a cold, clinical precision that made the prosecution's experts look like amateurs. Finally, Lily, the investigative journalist, laid out a paper trail that led directly away from Elias and straight to the real culprit. The audience's satisfaction comes from the realization that the invisible man was actually the most protected man in the room. The girls he had raised in secret, the orphans he had shielded from the world, had become the world's most formidable shields. By the time the verdict was read, the roles had completely swapped. The prosecutor was the one stuttering. The corrupt accusers were the ones cowering, and the poor janitor was standing tall, flanked by the three most powerful women in the city. The status reversal reveal is so effective because it rewards the audience's sense of justice. It proves that the kindness Elias sowed in the shadows was powerful enough to walk into the light and demand the truth. He started the day as a victim of the system and ended it as the father of the women who broke that system to save him. The hierarchy of the world hadn't just been challenged. It had been demolished. The most profound languages are often those that never make a sound. For Elias Thorne, love wasn't a poem or a grand proclamation. It was the rhythmic scratch of a brush against a floor at 3:00 a.m. and the dull ache in a stomach that hadn't seen a full meal in 2 days. This is the story of sacrifice as a silent language, where every act of denial was a hidden brick in the foundation of someone else's future. Elias understood early on that in a world obsessed with status, his presence was a liability to the three girls he had taken in. Sarah, Emily, and Lily were white, and the world was prepared to offer them doors that would remain forever locked to a man like him. He knew that if he walked them to the gates of their elite schools, the whispers would start. The stigma of his poverty and his race would cling to them like soot, slowing their ascent. So, Elias chose the most difficult form of love. He chose to be a ghost. His sacrifice was a symphony of small, quiet choices. There was the full plate lie. Every evening, he would set the table for the girls with the best food his meager wages could buy. Chicken, fresh vegetables, milk. He would sit with them, sipping a glass of water, claiming he had already eaten a large meal at the office. In reality, his meal was the satisfaction of watching the color return to their cheeks. His hunger was the price of their health, a transaction made in total silence. Then there was the new shoes miracle. When Emily needed expensive orthopedic shoes for her back, or when Sarah needed a blazer for a debate competition, the money would simply appear in a jar on the counter. The girls thought it was luck or perhaps a blessing. They never saw Elias taking the triple shift weekends, cleaning out grease traps in industrial kitchens where the heat was so intense it peeled the skin off his forearms. He would come home while they were sleeping, hide his bandaged hands, and place the money in the jar before slipping into his own bed for 2 hours of restless sleep. The silence of his sacrifice extended to their public lives. On the day of Sarah's law school graduation, Elias didn't sit in the front row. He didn't even buy a ticket. He stood in the very back of the hall, hidden behind a pillar, wearing his janitor's uniform underneath a heavy coat so no one would see. He watched through the crowd as she took her diploma, his heart swelling so hard it felt like it might burst. He didn't need her to point him out to her peers. He didn't need the thank you speech. The sight of her standing tall, untainted by the struggle he had endured to get her there, was the only currency he required. This silent language is what made the courtroom revelation so devastatingly beautiful. For 25 years, Elias had spoken through his calluses, his hunger, and his absence. He thought he was successfully invisible. But as the girls stood to defend him, he realized they had been listening to his silence all along. They hadn't seen a janitor or a poor man. They had seen the man who ate water so they could eat meat. They had seen the man who stayed in the shadows so they could live in the light. Elias Thorne proved that the loudest way to say, "I love you," isn't with a voice. It's with a life lived entirely for the sake of another, written in the ink of sweat and the grammar of sacrifice. The legacy of justice is the poetic closure of Elias Thorne's life, a narrative arc where the seeds of mercy planted in the cracks of a broken pavement grow into a forest of protection. It is the ultimate full circle moment, proving that when you save a life, you aren't just changing their present, you are building the army that will one day fight for your future. The story begins with a system that had failed everyone involved. 25 years ago, the foster care system was prepared to chew up 3 young sisters and spit them out into separate lives of trauma. Elias, a man the system already looked down upon, stepped in to interfere. He didn't have a law degree, a medical license, or a press pass. He only had a mop and a moral compass. By hiding those girls and raising them in the shadows of his own poverty, he committed a crime of compassion. He broke the rules of a cold, bureaucratic world to follow the higher laws of humanity. But Elias didn't just give them a roof. He gave them the weapons they would eventually use to dismantle that same cold world. He knew that for children like them, orphans with no lineage, knowledge was the only true equalizer. Every cent he saved went toward the tools of the system. He bought the law books Sarah used to understand how power is wielded. He bought the science kits Emily used to understand how bodies are healed. He bought the typewriter Lily used to understand how truth is told. The full circle moment occurs when that same broken system finally comes for Elias. Decades later, a wealthy and corrupt administrator tried to use Elias as a scapegoat for financial crimes. They chose him specifically because he appeared to be a man who had slipped through the cracks, a man with no defense, no voice, and no legacy. They expected him to be a victim of the system once again. However, they didn't realize that the system was now standing on Elias's side of the table. When the girls walked into that courtroom, they represented the 3 pillars of a functioning society: law, medicine, and truth. Sarah, the attorney, used the law to protect the man who had once broken it to save her. Emily, the surgeon, used her medical expertise to prove the physical impossibility of the prosecution's claims. Lily, the journalist, used the power of the press to expose the real criminals who thought they could hide in the dark. The tools Elias had provided them, the very education he had scrubbed floors to afford, were the same tools that cut through the lies meant to imprison him. He had spent his life protecting them from being processed by the state. Now, They were preventing him from being processed by a corrupt court. This isn't just a happy ending. It is a profound commentary on the nature of justice. It suggests that true justice isn't found in a gavel or a badge, but in the reciprocal bond of human care. Elias's legacy wasn't found in a bank account or a building with his name on it. His legacy was the 3 women who refused to let the man who saved them be destroyed by the world he had kept at bay for 25 years. The circle was complete. The saved had become the saviors, and the invisible man was finally seen through the brilliant light of the daughters he had created. In the world of Elias Thorne, family was not something you were born into. It was something you earned in the trenches of survival. The concept of asterisk found family versus blood asterisk serves as the emotional heartbeat of this story, proving that the most unbreakable bonds are those signed in sweat and sacrifice rather than DNA. The contrast in this story is stark and intentional. On one side you have Elias, an aging black man, a product of the working class struggle in Detroit, a man whose life has been defined by labor and invisibility. On the other side, you have 3 young white girls who, by all societal standards, belong to a completely different world. Biology gave them nothing in common. History and social structures suggested they should be strangers. Yet, when Elias found Sarah, Emily, and Lily shivering in that basement, the blood requirement for fatherhood vanished instantly. For Elias, the choice to become their father was a radical act of loyalty. He didn't have to stay. There was no legal document forcing him to spend his meager earnings on their medicine or to skip his own meals so they could grow. In many ways, blood, family had already failed these girls. It had abandoned them to a cold basement in a city that didn't care if they vanished. Elias, a man who had every reason to be cynical about a world that rarely showed him kindness, chose to be the anomaly. He replaced the biological void with a foundation of consistent, unwavering presence. The racial and social contrast between them actually reinforces the depth of this bond. In a society that often tries to categorize people into us and them, Elias and his daughters created a third category, ours. Their loyalty was forged in a shared struggle that ignored the color of their skin. When Elias scrubbed floors to pay for Sarah's law books, he wasn't doing it because she looked like him. He was doing it because she was him, a part of the life he had chosen to protect. This theme reaches its climax in the courtroom, where the world is forced to confront this found family. To the prosecutor and the judge, the sight of 3 successful white professionals fiercely defending an elderly black janitor made no sense under the traditional rules of society. They looked for a motive, a biological connection, or a financial tie. They couldn't find one because they were looking for blood, while the girls were acting on debt. The girls didn't return to save Elias out of a sense of duty to a relative. They returned because he was the man who had redefined the word father through 25 years of silent action. Their loyalty was a choice, just as his original sacrifice had been a choice. They proved that while blood might define your beginning, it is your choices and the people who choose you back that define your life. In the end, the story of Elias and his daughters stands as a powerful testament to the fact that family is a verb, not a noun. It is something you do day after day in the shadows and the struggles. When the trial ended and the 4 of them walked out together, the contrast in their appearances didn't matter. What the world saw were 4 people bound by a history of mutual rescue. They were living proof that the strongest houses aren't built on genealogy, but on the ironclad loyalty of those who refuse to let each other fall.